everyone. Welcome to Bridge Church Online. We're so glad to have you with us this morning. I'm Kori.
And I'm Sam. Sorry Jono can't be with you today, but he's going to give the talk. I wouldn't have minded to have a double portion of Jono, but...
But you've got Sam instead.
Yeah, and the talk is going to be about loss today. Have you ever lost anything, Kori?
Oh, many things, I'm sure, but one story does spring to mind. Not something I've lost, something our father has lost. Last year we went on a family holiday to Belfast. Do you remember this? And we visited the Parliament there, Stormont. So we had to get our entrance tickets and then go through security where they scan everything. We get through to the other side and Dad is all of a fluster, holding things in his hand and his mouth. And then he realised he'd lost his ticket. And he's getting more and more flustered. It just makes me laugh thinking about it. Where's it gone? I've kind of lost it. They've just given it to me. And I looked at him and I said, Dad, it's in your mouth.
It was in his mouth.
The whole time he was looking for it everywhere. So there you go.
Traumatic
for Dad. Hilarious for the rest of us. So if you haven't gathered, Sam is my brother, for those of you that don't know us. And our dad, Andy Buttress, is the leader of Bridge Church. And he has got a little message to come later on. But first of all, what are we doing, Sam?
Life stories.
This is Life Stories. And we are going to go to the first part of our talk.
From Jono.
From Jono on the subject of loss as we near the end of our series on mental health and well-being.
Grab a cuppa
and enjoy.
Buckle in.
Well, good morning, Bridge Church, and my name is Jono, and I'm really excited to be sharing with you guys this morning a short message looking at the theme of loss as we continue on our series on mental health and well-being. For those of you that don't know me, I've been at Bridge Church since we started at the start of this year, and I'm the co-leader of the sung worship team with my partner Kori, and you might have seen us leading Life Stories together since lockdown. So I will be sharing some of my personal experiences today on loss, and we'll also delve into the Bible and see how God's worked in the life of someone in particular when dealing with loss. There's probably going to be some quite difficult stories and things that we talk about today. I really value talking about mental health and loss in really real terms. So that's just a pre-warning, and I really hope that you find this a useful message. Probably one of the hardest things that we face is loss. Loss is something which can mean different things to all of us. Now, being a Suffolk lad, growing up in Suffolk, I've supported Ipswich Town for nearly 2 decades, and to lose away our nearest and dearest rivals in a playoff semi-final in 2015, for me was devastating as a loss. That might seem trivial, but it felt real at the time. And there are probably some harder examples of loss. Could it be a job you've lost that you loved working at? Could it be the loss of friends or family due to an argument and you haven't spoken to them for years? Could it be the tragic loss of someone you dearly loved? We might lose health and need to adjust entirely to a new lifestyle. These losses cause sorrow and to grieve, which will most likely deeply affect all of our emotions. In September 2013, it was 2 months ahead to my cousin Elaine's wedding, the first wedding on the mum's side of my family. And having grown up close with our cousins, spending time down at theirs, at ours, spending weekends at Newhaven Fort on the south coast where they lived, to late evenings playing Uno with Amy, Elaine, Martin and my brothers and my auntie and uncle, even to my incredible magic trick shows I used to do. This was a really exciting period coming up to Elaine's wedding. In September, I remember receiving a telephone call from my mum at work. Immediately I knew this was strange to be getting a call from my mum. So she asked me and my 2 brothers to get home from work as soon as we could. I was immediately mulling over my mind, well, what could be that serious that she called? Could it be our cat's died? Probably not, she wouldn't call for that. Could it be one of our elderly grandparents had a fall or became ill in hospital? It was a long drive home from work that day. our cousin Martin, the eldest cousin, had tragically passed away. I can remember the silence that preceded Mum telling me that. The shock, the surprise, the hurt, the pain, the loss. Being the eldest, Martin was not only a big brother to Elaine and Amy, he was a big brother to me and my brothers. We played basketball, football, video games as much as we could. I still to this day miss and love Martin. And so shortly after Martin's tragic death at 26, Elaine's wedding was one of the most incredibly emotional times that we've probably been through as a family. On one hand, you've got my Uncle Colin marrying his first daughter, but then you've got Elaine not having her big brother at her wedding day. It was painful. Loss brings pain. Pain brings grief. And grief is a feeling of deep mental anguish caused by loss. Grief can also be sorrow for something that someone has done or failed to do. Now, because we live in a fallen world, and by fallen world I mean a world which is sadness, hunger, poverty, extortion, life inevitably includes sorrow. When sin entered the human race, it brought death, physical death, and spiritual death, with all the accompanying ramifications. Now, death or loss of anything we value causes grief. However, God has a higher purpose for his people, and he is faithful to use our most painful times to mature us and bring us closer to him. Now, we're going to spend some time just looking at the Bible, which is inspired by God but had many authors thousands of years ago. So we're going to look at the Old Testament in the Bible, which is the first part before Jesus' birth, and look at a woman who suffered the loss of everything. She was no stoic, no super saint. She felt the bitterness and hopelessness that accompanied loss. As we look a bit closer at Naomi this morning, we'll learn a lot about the God who cares for us in grief. Here's how Naomi's story unfolded. There was a famine in Israel. A Hebrew man named Elimelech took his wife Naomi and his two sons, Mahlon and Kilion, to live in a neighbouring country called Moab. The family only intended to stay temporarily, but once they settled down in that godless society, they remained there for 10 years. In that time, the two sons married pagan women. During those Moab years, I'm sure Naomi, in particular, felt a sense of loss. She was an alien in a foreign land. And now she had two Moabites as daughters-in-law. She must have thought, if only we'd stayed in Bethlehem, where they were from, she'd have daughters-in-law from their own people who understand their faith and customs. But sadly, the worst is yet to come. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons, and they had lived there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Kilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. And that's from the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 3 to 5. Naomi's future could not have been more hopeless, because she had no one to provide for her. In Israel, if a widow had no family, she was cared for by the community. But they didn't have so much humane laws in Moab. She's there in a foreign land, lost those that are closest to her, and feeling like she's got nowhere to go, no help, no hope on the horizon. So with the news came that the famine had ended in Israel, she prepared to go back home. When she told her two daughters-in-law what she intended to do, they wanted to go with her, but she said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? I'm not going to have any more sons. Who could become your husbands?" So my first point this morning is take time to feel your pain. It's clear that these women loved each other. They'd all suffered terrible losses, and they'd wept together at the thought of separation, of Naomi going back to Israel. They demonstrate something important here, I think, that God gave us tears to express our grief. As the beautiful passage from another book in the Old Testament reminds us, there is a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Yes, there's a time for all these beautiful things, for laughing, for dancing, but there's also a time for mourning and weeping. That's from a book called Ecclesiastes. So here's a lesson. If you're experiencing grief for any reason, allow yourself time to mourn and to weep. If you try to hold your tears in, or to ignore your pain, or to bottle it up, there might be serious problems later on. God gave us tears for our grief, an outpouring of this inner pain. Now I find again, looking at the Bible, one of the most freeing verses in the Bible is also one of the shortest ones. Now, it comes to a man called Jesus, who was the Son of God, who came to earth. He came to the home of Mary and Martha after one of their friends, Lazarus, had died. He saw their grief. He understood their grief. And even though he knew in a few moments' time that he would perform a miracle and raise Lazarus from the dead, the scripture from the Bible where it says this in John 11 verse 38, Jesus wept. And I think those two words give us permission to weep in our sorrow, because they reveal how Jesus modelled, how Jesus showed us that it's a normal response to grief is to weep, to cry. Don't think it's more spiritual or better to hold your tears in. Now, going back to Naomi, she wasn't afraid to feel her grief. She was obviously in extreme pain, but it's quite clear who she blamed for her loss. And as we look a bit further on in Ruth 1, it says, "The Lord's hand has gone against me. Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty, God, has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Now, this part screams to me that Naomi's depressed. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you agree with that? The Lord's hand has gone against me. He has afflicted me, emptied me, brought misfortune on me, made my life very bitter. Her misery was evident in her demeanour, because once she got back to Israel, her old friends hardly recognised her. She still had no certainty about the future, and you can't blame her for that. By now, her daughter-in-law Ruth had insisted on returning to Bethlehem with her, but how were they to live? Naomi felt abandoned by God, and she had no reason to think positively or to think otherwise. I wonder whether you've ever felt like that. Have you ever felt abandoned, not loved? Despair of the thought of uncertainty in the future? I know I have. But we can learn some really valuable principles about grief from Naomi and her amazing story. Throughout the rest of the chapter, we can see these principles and learn ways to deal not only with our own grief, but with the grief of others. My second point is grief may cause despair or depression, but this is natural. During times of sorrow, grief, our emotions are like a roller coaster. On the downside, we shouldn't be surprised by feelings of despair or depression. They're not unnatural feelings. And in Naomi's depression, despair, I'm sure she asked the questions we all ask when sorrow comes. Why? Why would God allow this? Could he not have stopped this? Could he have saved my job? Why did my husband die so young? Why couldn't God restore my marriage? Now, I heard a story in New York when someone was killed instantly in a bizarre accident. She was driving home from seeing her mother in a nursing home when a landscaping truck pulling a trailer crossed 3 lanes and hit her head on. This lady driver was gentle, she was gracious, she was caring, she had a loving husband, children, grandchildren. And it's so easy to sit here and think, well, if only she'd been 1 car left behind, or why did God let this happen? There's a man named Elijah in the Bible, a key prophet, which means he had a close relationship and could hear from God. He held a dead son of a widow he stayed with during a famine, and he cried out to God, "O Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy also upon this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" I think God can handle it when we question him, when we question the ways of our fallen world and put blame on him. But he wants us to accept what he sends and still trust his goodness and his love. He has a purpose for our sorrow and loss. And that this morning, is my third point. And that's to believe that God has a purpose for our loss and for our sorrows, but for good. Some of our afflictions might come as consequences of sin. Others are intended to keep us from sin. Some come to make us draw closer to God and to enable us to grow spiritually. Now, I know that sounds quite strange, but some heartaches simply make us realise that God's way is the right way. Whatever the pain, God means it for good in our lives, as he did with a man named Joseph. Now, I'm hoping some of you have heard of Joseph. He went from prisoner to prince, and it's worth repeating what Joseph was able to do and say 20 years after he lost everything, through the hatred and cruelty of what his brothers had done to him, selling him to slavers to be a slave and a prisoner in Egypt. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph ended up being Pharaoh's right-hand man, after many years of pain and loss of life, being imprisoned as a slave. Joseph certainly couldn't have said that during a time where he was beaten up, where he was imprisoned, where he was a slave, where he was tempted, where he felt worthless. But sometimes it takes time for us to see the pattern that God had in mind when there was sorrow in our lives. We do know God is sovereign. Nothing happens in heaven or earth that God does not know about. And that can be tough to understand, but if we don't believe it, we'll swing aimlessly around abyss and unbelief, uncertainty and despair. So I want you to think about the worst loss you've suffered. Can you consider these questions? Can you think of anything good that's come out of it? Have you been able to help others just because of what you've experienced yourself? Do you have more compassion for others? Or perhaps did it bring you closer to God? Now, I'm sure some of you watching this will be able to say yes to most of those questions. They're tough questions, but God has a purpose for our sorrows and our despair.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Jono. We'll be going back to that in our second part.
We will. But now we have for you a slightly different interview, a kind of live action interview by Kieran, who is interviewing his mum, our mum, on the subject of mental health and loss.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Lovely British weather today. Hope we don't get rained on.
Yep, that's right.
So, what are we doing today, Mum? Oh, would you like to introduce
I
yourself?
will. I'm Dawn and I go to Bridge Church, and we are now on our way to my mum's care home to see my mum for the first time since March, when the COVID virus came and then we couldn't go to see her. So it's going to be a good day, or good time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to seeing Nanny too.
yeah, be good.
Okay, could you explain a bit about the situation and the build-up the last year or two?
Yeah. In 2019, my mum developed Alzheimer's, and it started with her beginning to forget things, and till eventually it got to the point that mum couldn't look after herself anymore because mentally she wasn't able to do that. And so January of this year she came into a lovely care home, and she's been very happy there, and the staff have been amazing, and all through the time of the COVID outbreak they've kept me informed and sent me lovely WhatsApp messages.
So, how are you feeling about today, Mum?
I think I've got mixed feelings. I'm really looking forward to seeing my mum,
Yeah,
but I know that mum's memory, and with the Alzheimer's you can forget your members of family. So it may be today that when I see mum, because there's been this long gap, that she might not remember me. But I'm all prepared for that. I've had to work through that process, although it's not easy.
thanks, Mum. So how has your faith been affected, and how's your faith in God supported you and affected the way you live through these situations?
My faith in God has been very real. I've known him very close to me, even though in the most difficult of times as well. I've found a strength which I know doesn't come from me, that comes from him. And I've had great friends that have supported me through it in prayer as well, and that has given me strength.
Yeah. Do you want to say a bit about what you told me about Nanny remembering?
Yeah. One day, when I knew Mum first had Alzheimer's, I was really upset, because I thought, what will happen when she doesn't know us? And I really felt God speak and say, it's okay, she will know me and I'll be with her. Sorry, it's a bit emotional.
What?
Just come to see Mum, and it's absolutely lovely to see her.
Do you want to say hello to everyone?
Samuel.
Yeah, Samuel come next time. Would you like to say anything to Samuel? Yeah, I'll tell him. I'll tell him you said that.
Yeah.
Bless Samuel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yours are green. What about Mum's?
Brown. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. Oh, green this time, Mum. Looking. Blue eyes. Yeah, I have blue eyes. What about Mum? What about Mum's eyes? Green. And what colour are yours?
Green.
They're very beautiful
Hi,
green
we've just
eyes.
been to see my mum and we had a lovely time with her outside, and we've been given a lovely letter and box of chocolates for the home to say thank you for being patient over these last few months when we couldn't get to visit Mum. And yeah, it's been lovely. So I think the actual overall was positive. The event was quite positive.
Yeah. This Sunday, as you know, we're particularly looking at the subject of loss. So, over the last year, and particularly with Nanny in lockdown, have you felt a sense of loss?
Yes, having Alzheimer's is very difficult in some ways, in the sense that you do lose the person that you know and love, even though that they are still alive. They're not actually the person that you have known, and so I found that a bit of a loss, because there's sometimes I think, oh, I would love to tell Mum or ask her certain questions about things, and I know that Mum is still alive and with us, but she wouldn't be able to answer those questions. So it's a loss, really, in that way. And also, I think having Alzheimer's is very strange in one way, because you have the person still with you, but in some ways you don't. And because of that, you do go through a sense of emotions of feeling that you have lost that person, even though that they are still here. And like I said earlier in the interview, it's been great to have the support of friends and family. A few months ago, I started clearing through Mum's things that she wouldn't need anymore. And I was fine. And then sometimes I would find something in Nanny's belongings and items, and it would make me be really upset, because I knew that Nanny wouldn't be using this particular item again, or there was some certain memory. So that in itself has been very difficult. I think through the situation that we don't know in life when things are going to happen that are difficult and hard, but I think through this situation, it's taught me how to not to take things for granted, and to appreciate every moment, and particularly like last year when I spent lots of time looking after Mum and helping her. I'm really thankful for those times now, because now Mum is in the home, I don't get to see him so much with the virus that's happened. So I guess I'm thankful for that. Very much, yeah.
Yeah. To make most of the time we have.
Yeah. So I think answer to your question is to make the most of the time you have.
Thanks, guys, for that powerful insight.
And now back to Jono for part 2.
Now, I've been listening to a TED talk from a lady called Lucy Hone on resilience. Now, Lucy started studying resilience research about a decade to 12 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. She finished her studies in America and then went back to her homeland's Christchurch in New Zealand to start her doctoral research. And just as she started her researches for her doctoral, the Christchurch earthquakes hit, so that all got put on hold. But she began working with her local communities to help them through that terrible post-quake period, working with all sorts of organisations to government departments and talking and teaching and helping them to learn and think and act with resilience and help them boost that. So Lucy thought at this time her calling was there. But sadly she was wrong. In 2014, on the Queen's birthday weekend, Lucy's family and 2 other families decided to go to a lake and bike out to the ocean. At last minute, her 12-year-old daughter decided to jump in the car with her best friend Ella, and Ella's mum, Sally, who was a dear friend of Lucy's. Sadly, on the way to the lake, a car sped through a stop sign, crashing into them and killing all 3 of them instantly. Instead of being this resilience expert, Lucy described herself as being the grieving mother, waking up, not knowing who she is, trying to get to grips with the unthinkable news. Her world had changed forever. Suddenly, she was the one on the end of all this expert advice. Lucy says, "I can tell you, I didn't like what I heard one bit from this advice. It is easy to sit and talk and suggest and advise, but it's hard to be in that situation." It's basically what she's getting at there. But there's one main part of this TED Talk which really stood out to me. Lucy went on to say, "Choose life, not death. Don't lose what you have to what you have lost." Now, in psychology, she says we call this benefit finding. In her Brave New World, it involved trying to find things to be grateful for. At least her girl hadn't died of some terrible, long, drawn-out illness. She died suddenly, instantly, sparing Lucy of her pain. They had a lot of support, social support from family and friends to help them through. And most of all, they still had 2 beautiful boys to live for, who needed them now more than ever and deserved a normal life. It was more of a normal life as they could give them. Being able to switch your focus of your attention to good is shown by science to be a really powerful strategy. Now, God uses everything in our lives to make us more like Jesus. And Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. So I've asked before myself, well, how can I bypass sorrow and grief? But then how can you still expect to develop maturity emotionally and spiritually? We just can't decide to skip that. Going back to Naomi, I don't think she saw the plan that God had for her. A plan to meet her need and restore her faith and joy. And it's easy to feel like that. God used the hopeless situation to get her back to her land where he could bless her. And best of all, he gave her Ruth, a daughter-in-law who was committed to her for life. So Ruth was a great blessing. So as we read on in that chapter, you'll see that Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem at the beginning of harvest time. Now there was no famine there. There was no welfare system in those days, but there was a way for the poor to get help. So farmers could only reap their fields once. Grapes could only be picked from the vines once. The widows and the poor were then to glean what was left over. This was workfare, not welfare. And since Ruth was younger and stronger, she spoke up, basically saying, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone else whose eyes I find favour." So Naomi said to her, "Great, go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean the fields with harvests. And as it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to a man named Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech, who, as we know, was the husband of Naomi. She found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz. 10 little words behind them was the hand of our Almighty God working, keeping his promise to defend the cause of the fatherless and the widow, giving them food and clothing. So God is working even when we can't see it. God had a plan for Ruth and Naomi. It wasn't for an endless struggle to exist. He had a wonderful future planned out for them. He didn't reveal it to them ahead of time, which would have been nice. I always think that. But what he really wants from us is faith, simple faith, childlike faith, trust in his goodness, his power and love. Look forward to the future with hope. When Naomi returned to Bethlehem, she arrived with a hopeless state of mind, which is often, the results of grief. And when we grieve, we can see nothing but bleakness, no hope, no future. But if we keep remembering that God loves us, and God has the power to help us and provide for our future, we're able to keep this hope alive and keep our faith strong. Now, the rest of this book that we've been reading is a wonderful romance. Boaz loved Ruth, and Naomi instructed Ruth in the way to claim her rights under a covenant at the time, which meant that Boaz immediately and gladly did all the legal things necessary to marry Ruth and make his wife. So we read that Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. Then he went to her and the Lord enabled her to conceive and she gave birth to a son. What a different story God's now painting to what we saw through the heartache and the loss and sorrow that Naomi saw and Ruth saw in a foreign land. Most importantly, I think, that we see from the Bible is that Jesus showed us that God has feelings. So Jesus came in part to reveal to us what the invisible God is like. What Jesus felt, God still feels. Listen to the Lord's description of himself to Moses in a book in Exodus, another man who had a close relationship with God in the Old Testament. It says in Exodus 34 and verse 6, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Compassion, anger and love are all emotions which God feels. He knows how we feel when we suffer loss. And during Jesus' time on earth, there was one particular story that stands out. He came upon a funeral procession. The dead person was the only son of a widow, and she was accompanied by a large crowd of mourners who shared her grief. And we read this in Luke, a book in the New Testament, which describes the events of Jesus' time on earth. And in Luke chapter 7:13, we read of Jesus' reaction to this tragic scene. It says, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her and he said, don't cry. Now, I want us to believe that God heals wounds and joy will come because he knows and feels what we feel and he wants what's best for us. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. You don't need to rush it when it comes. It won't in any way diminish the preciousness of the one who was taken or the loss we've had. But wait for God's timing of healing and restoration. The famous Psalms, which are a book of crying out to God a lot of the time. In Psalm 30 it says, his anger is but for a moment, and his favour is for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but joy comes in the morning. I love this verse. Joy comes in the morning. Now, the point of this isn't about a clock where every morning joy will come. It's not the point of that statement. The point of it is that God doesn't leave his children indefinitely in the depths of sorrow. Joy comes eventually when dawn comes, but in God's timing. Now, as I close this morning, grief, sorrow, depression are all normal things to go through. Don't feel ashamed for doing so. But with God, I want you to know we have a hope. We have someone to walk alongside every step of the way. In the deepest valley, in the darkest storms, God is there. Now, I'm not saying it makes the pain of loss or sorrow or grieving or depression to disappear, but fix your eyes on the hope that joy will come in the morning. I want to leave with two simple questions. Would you ask Jesus to help you through your loss? Would you invite him into your life and share in the hope of Jesus, choosing life, not death?
Thanks, Jono, for sharing that really profound message with us this morning.
Yeah, and as we draw near to the end of our series on mental health and well-being, here is a taster of what's to come and how you can get involved.
There's a contemporary poet called Steve Turner who has written this little poem that goes like this. History repeats itself. It has to. No one listens. And at this time, we need to be people who listen and who learn, because we are living through momentous times. We think of World War I, we think of World War II, we think of 9/11. But this pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic, is up there. And in the future, this time will be remembered, not by just our own children, but, generations after that too. So we need to think about what we're learning from this time. We talk about the new normal, but what's to say that in a year's time, that new normal will look very much like the old normal? Things will be just back to normal. But we must learn from this time. And when we do life stories in August, we're going to look at some of the subjects that we need to consider about how we're learning and what we're learning as we go forward into the future, so that the world is a better place. I like the story that has come out over the last few weeks about Marcus Rashford, the England and Manchester United footballer, who grew up on a impoverished estate in Manchester, Wythenshawe. He knew what it was to experience poverty and hunger. And then over the last few weeks, when he realised that the government was withdrawing funding for meal vouchers for children on the poverty line, he started a campaign and wrote to people of influence and managed basically to overturn the government's policy, and now 1.3 million parents can access meal vouchers over the summer. You see, he remembered his past, he remembered his experiences, and that is exactly what we need to do regarding this time that we've just come through and the time we're in now. We've got to remember what we've gone through and learn from that. So what are you learning from this time? And that's what we're going to look at in Life Stories. Now, if you want to be a part of that, why don't you send in a 1-minute video telling us what you have learnt through this time. Send it to Kori at bridgechurchipswich.org.uk. Send it to her within the next few weeks, maybe by the end of July, and you can be part of Life Stories in August. So join us in August for this really important series, Learning from Lockdown. Because if we don't learn from lockdown, history might repeat itself.
Thanks, Andy. We're really looking forward to that. At home, please do get involved. Send in your videos. We'd love to hear about what you have got from this series.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful week.
See you same time, same place next week.
See ya.